Welcome back to the Smart Investor Show. Today, we're joined by Mike Mortlock, one of Australia's most recognised names in property investment and tax depreciation. Mike is a Managing Director of MCG Quantity Surveyors and a trusted voice in the investor community, known for making the complex world of depreciation tangible and actionable for property investors. Mike has worked with thousands of property investors and developers across the country, helping them unlock hidden value and maximise their returns through strategic depreciation schedules. He's also the host of the popular podcast Geared for Growth, where he interviews industry experts and digs into trends shaping Australia's property market. Beyond his professional accomplishments, Mike is a passionate aviator, recently earning his pilot's licence, and brings that same sense of precision and curiosity to how he approaches the property market. Whether he's analysing data, flying high, or forecasting what's next for investors, Mike's insights are always sharp, relatable, and grounded in real-world experience. I'm really looking forward to getting into some of Mike's latest research and hearing where he sees the opportunity in the current climate. Mike Mortlock, welcome to the Smart Investor Show.
Thanks for having me. I've been really excited to come on.
Oh, it's good to be on the other side of the camera with you today and have a chat, get to know you a little bit better around personally, and also if I'm get some pearls of wisdom for you for our listeners.
I hope so. Let's hope so.
I know you've just hopped off a plane and got to work, so we will excuse you if you're a little bit groggy or need a coffee in between.
Thank you.
So, mate, where I'd like to start is just go back, rewind the clock a little bit and talk about Mike growing up, the childhood, any sort of memories on that childhood that sort of put you to where you are today. And then, it'd be good to talk a little bit more about MCG as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was born in Penrith. Got to be careful who you tell people that.
But I like what you said with the TH, not the double F, which is
Penrith. I was born in the Riff. I left when I was 2. Obviously, I had help. But I don't identify as a Sydney side. I moved to country New South Wales, a little place called Yerong Creek, which is about half an hour out of Wagga Wagga, and lived there until I was 12 and then moved to Griffith in New South Wales. So very much a country New South Wales boy, and moved to sort of the greater Newcastle area when I was 16 in about 1997. There'll be people listening that were born post-2000, the millennium. I'm just showing my age. But yeah, I guess that's formative, right? I grew up in places where people wave at you when they're driving past because they either know you or they definitely know someone that knows you. And I think that's kind of, I suppose, held me in good stead today. I mean, we're very focused on our customer service, and I think it's that old school country ethic. You do right by people and you do a good job for people.
Yeah, no, that would have been a very different upbringing to where if you did stay in the city. And so grew up in the country and then studied all the way through your education there before you moved back?
Yeah, so I suppose I was at the end of year 9 when I moved to sort of the Newcastle area, and I've sort of stayed within 40 Ks of that place, ever since 1997. All I really wanted to do was be in the military and specifically a fighter pilot, but I had a bit of a lumpy journey there. My best mate was exactly in the same boat, but I had chronic fatigue syndrome and was on full-time medication, and he had epilepsy, so neither of us had any chance whatsoever. It didn't stop us doing flexed arm entry requirement physical tests in the garage just in case we got the call up. But yeah, look, what I probably really should have done is learnt to fly something else rather than fast jets, but I threw the toys out of the pram and didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. So I did year 11 and 12 over 3 years, and because there was a bit of a gap, I was interested in property and real estate, so I studied in real estate, and I had a very illustrious 10-month career that was fairly well a dismal failure because as an introvert, it's not the kind of role that I think that you can thrive in, and I was a lot more reserved and shy back then. I've learnt to be able to speak to people, but I realised I liked the data and the analytics side of things, so I actually very close to becoming a property valuer, but I ended up sort of changing at the last minute to do a Bachelor of Construction Management and become a quantity surveyor. Now, quantity surveyors do all sorts of different things. You can get very much into the nuts and bolts of construction and estimating, but I chose to focus in the tax side of things, which is probably least attractive side of quantity surveying, definitely the nerdiest side, but it definitely helped that analytical side of the brain. And now my favorite thing to do, other than help people save money on tax, is to tell stories with the data. And we've been doing that since 2011 now. So we've been going along.
As someone who likes tax and accounting, but you have a personality, so you are an oddball in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I can turn the personality on in short intervals, and after that, I'm a very boring homebody.
Right, or you like to ride bikes for long distances.
That's true, yes.
Well, that's great story, and thanks for sharing that with us. It helps us really paint the picture on I guess now the journey from, so as you said, you went and studied, and tell me about the MCG story.
Yeah, so I worked for a quantity surveying firm prior to starting MCG Quantity Surveyors. My business partner sort of worked in the other side of quantity surveying, the traditional estimating side of things, and we decided to get together, more than a decade ago now. And we started very, very humbly. We started working from our front bedroom in our houses. And now there's 30 odd of us and we work across the country. So it's been a hell of a ride and lots of fun. And, we've got some good sort of accolades and stories along the way. And we certainly enjoy what we do.
And that bedroom must be pretty packed now, or have you moved out to an office somewhere in Newcastle?
Well, our first employee, who I'm very pleased to say is still with us today, she actually used to come to my house and work.
Right.
When we were expanding and realised we needed a receptionist, we kind of thought, well, this was Carly, the first employee. She was actually my assistant in my previous job, and then she went and did some other things and then came on board. So I already knew her, but having a stranger come to my house, I thought, that's probably a bridge too far. So we got our first office after that. So thankfully,
HR would have been all over you on that one, wouldn't they?
Yeah, there's too many things that could go wrong in those scenarios. So we moved to a professional office.
Wow, that's quite a journey to where you are today. I guess it's a good segue talking about data. And one of the things we all enjoy reading, those of us in the industry, is your sentiment analysis. It's something you do like to talk about and share with either your clients or even anyone who'll listen to you. What are you seeing today? So I guess toward the end of last year, what you got from your data that you ran in that sentiment analysis, and where does that sort of place us into 2025?
Yeah, look, I guess if we look at 2024, we saw investor loans making up 38.3% of new housing finance, and that peaked as much as 44% in New South Wales. So in terms of sentiment and confidence, it's a brave new world. And I think, as you would know, as a buyer's agent par excellence, just that 25% basis point, it did a disproportionately big thing compared to the impact that it actually has in the real world. It's not going to change your cost of living pressures. It's not going to mean you can borrow twice as much, but it is kind of like an indicator. And there are a lot of people that are kind of sitting on the fence. So certainly what we're seeing now is a renewed interest in property. But when it comes to I suppose, where people are buying around the country, those are the types of stories that we collect and we like to share as much as we can. So for 2024, our number one statistical Area 3 location was actually Townsville. That is a market that has done very, very well. I mean, you'll know better than I, but I think people were able to buy, 3-bedroom houses around $400,000 a couple of years ago. We're now probably talking into the sixes. From a macro sort of point of view, what really happened in 2023 and 2024, I think that was the rise of the affordable markets. And if you think back to, say, 2022, the Perth median house price was the second cheapest in Australia after Darwin, right? So there were certain markets like Brisbane, like Adelaide, like Perth that were relatively cheap. And if we have a look at, say, WA compared to Queensland, in 2022, about 17% of all of our property investors were buying in WA. At the same time in 2022, year, 36% were buying in Queensland. You fast forward 12 months to 2023, 34% were buying in WA and 36% in Queensland. And then in 2024, it went from 32 in WA to 41% in Queensland. So WA was really the breakout one, but I suppose, you know, Queensland is a much bigger state. So you do have places like your southeast Queensland, your Gold Coast, your Brisbane, but all of these markets along the coast, you know, like Mackay and Gladstone and Bundaberg, but Townsville's the one that we saw doing a disproportionately high amount of transactions for investors within our database. So I found that quite interesting, those cheaper regional markets or those cheaper capital cities. But right now, you know, Perth is not a cheap capital city anymore.
No, it's very interesting because obviously a lot of that will align with how we've been buying as well, right? And which makes sense, you know, getting into Perth a little bit earlier in that 2021 and then getting a team in there in 2022. So that aligns with your data around that being one of the biggest years, 22 and 23, you said. And yeah, we've similar that, then got into a lot of that North Queensland area as well. And Townsville was definitely one of the areas we bought a lot of property in that earlier stage and phase, because now, like you said, it's really taken off. And that, as you said, affordable property areas, very difficult a little bit different in how we put that strategy together now for clients.
And look, I think when we had that unprecedented rise in interest rates, I mean, you couldn't get as much money in terms of being able to borrow for an investment property. So that really pushed people into those sorts of markets. But those markets, I think, are perennially popular because that's where the first home buyers will transact as well. And as we can see, which I think was announced today or the day before, you know, the coalition are now sort of focusing on that serviceability buffer from APRA, that 3% that they arbitrarily put on top of interest rates. They're proposing, if they win the election, to sort of give that a bit of a touch up. I didn't see the press release. I'm not sure if they were talking about across the market, but I assume they'll just zero in on the home buyers. And we are a country that holds home ownership in high regard. So any areas where home buyers, first home buyers are going to be active is also an opportunity for investors.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess with the election looming and a lot of the promises coming out and money getting thrown left, right and centre, it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. Maybe by the time this episode gets out or a little bit after, we're going to be able to see which way it's gone. No negative gearing talk at the moment, which is a good thing. But there's lots of other money being flying around for the other schemes, Help Me Buy, so on and so on.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and some positive things. I mean, in the budget, there's an increase in those places for the Help to Buy schemes. There's still not a huge increase in that. We definitely did have negative gearing chatter early on. It was, but I feel like it's actually good to get that out of the way because, I mean, what we've got to consider when we talk about these types of policies is that it's actually exacerbating the problem, because if we do want to minimise the impost of rent on people that are needing to rent, then minimising the supply of rental properties is not the way to do that. And removing negative gearing is a disincentive. And say, for example, if you look at places like WA that have increased let's say drop their land tax threshold to the point where basically every investor is paying land tax. Before that announcement, about 9% of our property investors were buying in Victoria, and straight after that happened, it dropped to 4%. Long-term average, Melbourne's done about 16% of everything. That's definitely changing now. I haven't got the latest data, but the seat of the pants indication is that Melbourne's becoming really popular. But that just goes to show what happens when we disincentivize investing. We actually shrink the pool, and it puts upward pressure on prices. So I'm I don't mean to get on my political soapbox, but I'm glad we've put that negative gearing stuff to the side.
Yeah, well, we've as we're recording today, the results just came out for this month from RP Data, CoreLogic, and Darwin was actually the number one city for a price increase.
That is an interesting one, and I'm a co-host on the Property Trio podcast, and we're about to do a Darwin special, and we've got all sorts of interesting data to share there. And I think my 2 cents on that is that it could quite reasonably be the best market for this for this calendar year. However, a bit like Perth, it's gone crazy. There's no doubt in that, but it's also had periods of 14 years where it's had zero growth. So it's just, I think, a cautionary sort of thing that I would like to say to people. Look, if you've got, say, a portfolio already and you want to roll the dice, go for it. But if this is your first investment property and you really need that growth, then maybe Darwin is a risky market, because there are certain people that I know won't invest in WA because they don't think the economy is diverse enough. It's too mining reliant. Well, Northern Territory is like that on steroids.
Yeah, we've seen that. And that's probably the advice we give as well around our investing. We haven't really gone too deep into Darwin for those reasons, but I'm sure I'll have egg on my face when you give me the results at the end of the year and tell me that Darwin was the number one growth city. But because I'm assuming if I asked you to think or remember what Darwin looked like in your last 2024 numbers, it would hardly be rating a mention, correct?
Oh, look, I don't even think it would hit a single % of investor transactions in 23 or 24. It's just not an area that has been popular for investment because it's quite a difficult place to understand, and it's not very diverse economically. I think what's happening with Darwin, which I think is distinct from any other time that I've seen, is that people are now asking that question, where is the next Perth? Now, I can't remember another time where people are saying, I need to get the next Hobart or something. There was a time where Hobart went through the roof, but people weren't talking it in the same way as they were about Perth. Everyone wants to figure out, how can I do 19% growth in 1 year, like the median price in Perth did? So that's leading them to places like Darwin, which is now far and away the cheapest capital city of any state or territory in Australia. So that's where the eyeballs are going. But it's an interesting market. And we probably shouldn't forget that the vast majority of it was destroyed by Cyclone Tracy in 76. And I think it was 76. And that fits into the insurance modelling. So it's also an expensive place to hold a property. And yes, the yields are higher, but you kind of need an 8 or 9% to be break even from a yield perspective. But anyway, there's far cleverer people like yourself that are all across that.
Well, particularly if people are going to buy apartments and units and things like that, well then you've got to think about not just those costs, as you mentioned, but also strata costs and potential repairs and maintenance and all those other things. And insurance, it's a good topic you brought up, because going back to Townsville, like we saw just doing insurance quotes before we contracted a property, sometimes it could be almost one side of the highway to the other. And we could see huge changes in the insurance policies.
Yeah, absolutely. And insurance has been a real passion project within our business for a number of years now. So one of the services that we provide, and I'm not trying to sell my stuff here, but just giving a bit of a context, we do insurance replacement cost estimates. So of course you can insure your property, but how much would it cost to actually rebuild it if it was damaged is a bit of a mystery to some people. Some people say, I paid $800, so I'll insure it for that. Some people will use online calculators. And the Insurance Council of Australia said pre-pandemic that 83% of homeowners are underinsured. And of course, we saw basically a 40% increase in construction costs during that pandemic. So that number would be even higher. So we've kind of adopted this catchphrase, I suppose, to cover the two sort of sides of owning a property. One is to maximize. Of course, we want it to grow, but when we talk maximizing, we're talking about maximizing your depreciation deductions, so you're paying less tax, but then protect. So maximize and protect. We're all very invested in growing our portfolios and growing our financial freedom, but we need to make sure we're protecting those assets as well.
The Smart Property Show is proudly brought to you by Search Party Property, nominated by REB as Australia's best buyers agency and buyers agent for 2025. Looking for your dream family home, a prime commercial property, or a smart investment? We've got you covered. Unlike others, we don't rely on selling agents or property managers. We have boots on the ground in key investment cities across Australia. Powered by data-driven insights, we give you the edge to secure the best deals. Ready to invest smarter and grow faster? Contact Search Party Property today for a complimentary discovery call. speaking of flogging products into businesses, we've also got a property management business in Brisbane, Redefined Property. And we did a call around before the cyclone that didn't happen was coming through. And you're right, it was an amazing amount of landlords who weren't adequately covered, or some not even just forgot to renew their policies and cover it all.
Yeah, I think the data is pretty terrifying on that. I think somewhere around about 20% of homes have no insurance whatsoever. And many of these properties are actually mortgage-backed properties. And we've spoken to financiers before. And of course, they're just looking to cover their exposure to the property. So if it's a 60% LVR, they've kind of modeled it into their system. So they don't really worry about underinsurance and even non-insurance. Look, they're not as worried about it because I suppose they're dealing with such high volumes. They've got that risk priced in. But for the individual homeowner, that's a terrifying situation to be in.
That's a big stat, 20%. That's huge to think of that. But yeah, it probably aligns with actually the research that came out of the back of calling all our clients to say, hey, are you secure? Do you need us to do anything? Or we haven't got your policy on file, which is what we normally would do. And that, kind of shocked us a little bit that we need to ensure that getting these guys locked away from an insurance and ensuring they're compliant. Well, that's, we've talked about Darwin, we've talked about some of that research coming out of the back of 2024 and past that as well. What do you think, Mike, with your crystal ball that I think you've got on your desk there somewhere on 2025? Are you seeing any early, we're one quarter down exactly. Have you seen any indicators, anything that surprised you, raised the eyebrows? Or what do you see for coming through this year?
Yeah, look, it definitely feels from an anecdotal and a data point of view, we're past the peak in Perth. I think that market has performed so strongly, so quickly that the data is really showing that it's slowing down a bit. I'm surprised by the resilience of Queensland and Brisbane. I think, there's always people that say, I remember a time where it was like Brisbane is only 60% of the price of Sydney, so it'll have to go up for that reason. And then for 10 years, it basically did nothing and stayed the same. We often observe things from a human kind of construct, but property markets don't really care about things like mean reversion. Like, okay, well, if say Melbourne would have been X, if it continued its trend, then, it's got to come up. Well, Melbourne's fundamentally different now with their economic problems and the land tax. So I just don't, I worry about people that are just looking for those cheap ideas about how to chase things. But we're certainly seeing Melbourne become much more popular with property investors. It's been in a dire state for a number of years. It's got some pretty severe economic problems, the land tax stuff, and just the sentiment around property investors is quite negative. You contrast, say, WA to Victoria. One good example is WA realised they had a bit of a problem with rentals, so they wanted to try and convince people to take their properties off Airbnb and put them on the long-term market. So what did they do? They gave you, I think it was a $10,000 bonus, whereas in Victoria, they're giving you a 7.5% tax. One's carrots, one's stick. And I think we've kind of seen the data of the investors that are sort of voting with their feet, as it were, and leaving Victoria. But we've now got to a point where, Victoria or Melbourne is going to overtake Sydney in terms of population. It is a very, very diverse economy. It's a beautiful, livable city, and it is cheap historically. So investors are certainly capitalising on that. So I expect Melbourne to do reasonably well, but I still think it's those affordable markets that are going to be able to perform well.
Yeah, no, I concur with all of that.
I was just about to ask, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think, 7.4%, 23-24, Melbourne's performance, negative performance. But if you look at that, Mike, prior to that, 19 years, Melbourne was the top performing market in Australia. Two chunks of really good growth. The one previous to that in early 2000s across, that was an 8-year, and then another, I think, 7 or so years of really, over 6% growth, which shows that it had a really long tail there. I remember buying, pre-COVID, well before COVID, when we just Geelong and these areas that did very well at the back, and then and moved into different areas from there. But we're seeing that. We went into Melbourne last year, and attending auctions and no real competition, things getting passed through, no one queuing up for opens, and did some, really good purchases for our clients. We've probably made money already if we go and revalue them. But now, 6 or 9 months in, I'm getting videos from our team down there, and there's people queued up everywhere. There's, huge numbers at auctions. So we're definitely seeing that heat in the market. A lot of the, I guess, buyers agents are in there now talking about it a lot more, which they were poo-pooing only a few months back, which is good. And I think what's going to happen, Mike, and this is what happened with Perth, which you would have seen as well, is once no disrespect, the mum and pop investors enter the market, they tend to get caught in that frenzy and fear of missing out stigma, and tend to overpay because they've either done a course somewhere online and they've been told you can do it yourself, go and buy a property, which is great. Most people can, but they tend to overpay because obviously they're getting their advocate or their advice from the selling agent.
Yeah.
So they're going to tell whatever the selling agent says, they're going to think they've got a great deal and they're going to pay that. And so we start seeing, I think the market, particularly next quarter, we'll see it grow faster because I feel the mum and dad investors are about to enter and they will start overpaying. And once they pay, even if it's 10 or 20 grand overs, that's the new price, right? And we keep going up from there.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I think what's different about property investing today than perhaps maybe 5 or 10 years ago is that we have these data houses, these research houses that drive the decisions of certainly some consumers, but often buyers agents. Now, if you go back 10 years ago, I think there was around about 200 buyers agents, and I know we're in excess of 2,000 buyers agents today. So when you've got all of these buyers agents that are using the same data and the same logic, you can move into a space and it becomes a real gold rush for chasing those properties. And one thing that I kind of worry about is the incentive to do the deal, not necessarily to do it at the right price, because that's the way that you make money. You get a property that's a reasonable purchase price, not paying a premium because you're worried that it's going to go up in value. And we've also got Facebook forums, and they're great areas for information and resources, but you've often got people jumping in there going like, what do you think about this area? And then you get all these eyeballs, tens of thousands of eyeballs on these locations. And I think we've become a little bit too drunk on the sugar hit sort of stuff. Yes, we all know that time in the market is what you get, but timing the market is also a bonus. But we've become very obsessed about timing the market, and it doesn't really matter. Let's say you look at Darwin, maybe it does 20% in 12 months, for example, but what is it actually going to do over 20 years? I mean, if you extrapolate that over 20 years and it does 3%, whereas there is a more modest market, let's say Melbourne only does 10% in its best year, but it perennially does 7.5 or 8%. It's not that long before it overtakes. And I think we should always remember that the best ways to achieve what you're trying to set out as a property investor is investing over the long term.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think the word is also the strategy. So it depends on the strategy of the client. And so if we only push them into one market, you do see that, and you do see some influencers, if we call them, on the property market, who can push markets just by flooding it through telling a bunch of people that are following them to go into that postcode, and they'll just go in there and they'll buy quickly because so-and-so has said to go and buy in there, and that drives markets fast, and that shows good results then for that influencer potentially to say, hey, we've increased 20% in the market that I predicted. But if you send 100 people there who are going to overpay, it's pretty easy to influence the market.
Yeah, and are you buyer number one or are you buyer 200? There's a very different outcome. And yes, I think we are at the point where buyers agents that are going in mass, let's say there's 1 or 2 big buyers agencies and maybe a couple of followers that look at what they do. If we're talking about places that have small populations and we're doing hundreds of transactions, that can create artificial movements. Now, that might be great if you know that you're the first person of, let's say, 10,000 that are going to buy in Wagga Wagga, or I'm just making up a place.
It's a pretty popular place right now, yeah.
Tamworth. Yeah, I mean, it's not cheap either, Wagga. I mean, it's got a really strong, robust economy. I haven't been there for a long, long time. But yeah, look, that does sort of worry me a little bit. And I think people should always remember that marketing is marketing, right? You've got to sort of tease that apart and ask further questions. And if you're happy with the answers to the question, then that's probably the right person to work with. But if you're not, then I encourage you to find someone that you know is going to look after your best interests, as I know that you guys do.
Yeah, we try our best. Sometimes I think we should change our name to John West because we reject so many deals, and you're like, wow. But actually, we just reviewed it today with Farah and just going through the amount of deals that we presented that we ended up either pulling out of the deal because it was getting too hot, or we just walked away from the deal. And so, and that holds us in good stead. And, we've been around for quite a while now, and we look forward to being around for a lot longer. And so that's something we feel very comfortable with. But, there are other people out there I've heard, like you were mentioning as well, who have proudly talked about, converting 95% of the deals they present. Again, I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with that, but like you said, is it about the deal, or is it about just closing deals because you've got to close a lot of deals a month because maybe you're a very big buyer's agent?
Yeah, look, I think to give another sort of parallel, like I could say something like, let's say I'm a buyer's agent. I could say, well, I win 90% of the auctions that I attend. Now, I know that there are some very, very gifted buyer's agents who do a lot of work at auctions in Melbourne whose conversion rate is going to be 40%. And am I a better buyer's agent because I win more? No, I might just be paying more, right? So winning is not necessarily the thing that's most important. And that's where I kind of think, like, for the consumer, I think for people in the industry like ourselves, we kind of think, oh, well, that's obvious, like you wouldn't fall for that. But for the consumer, it's hard and they can get bamboozled. But just ask that sort of devil's advocate question in your own head. Like, is that a good thing? Like, why would that be good necessarily if you've got that conversion rate?
Like you said, it's about the marketing, right? And the tagline, or the clickbait, as we call it. I mean, you hear the same thing on the other side, Mike. If you talk about sales agents who quite often put, big headlines are sold within 3 days or sold within a day is, again, that's great. That means they maybe have a good market. They're very good at selling, or have they just taken the first deal that came through, the first offer, and offloaded that product. So, yeah, I mean, we probably can go down a big, deep hole on that one, but we'll let that one go today.
We'll need a bottle of wine if we're going to unpack that one.
Exactly. Well, what's the time now? We could probably look at that. Mate, I guess it'd be good, going back to numbers and, the stuff that you geek out on and depreciation schedules. And quite often, I've heard you talk about, and we use the term as well, borrowing it from you, about leaving money on the table. Mm-hmm. And our clients, so we're obviously encouraging them to get a quantity surveyor and get them to have a look at their properties and see if there's anything left on the table. What are some of the, I guess, tricks and advice potentially that you could give to our listeners around that?
Yeah, look, I think I'm not a unique person in the tax depreciation space. There are lots of different quantity surveyors out there. And if you give your property address to a quantity surveyor, I don't know anyone that will charge you for advice to say this is worth paying for a report and this isn't worth paying for a report. So we either will do a report that we know puts more money back in your pocket than what it costs, or we won't do it, right? So a lot of people are just a little bit fearful. They feel like they're going to get on a mailing list, or they're going to get charged to get an estimate. I mean, they probably will get on a mailing list, let's be honest, but they won't be charged for a free estimate of the potential deductions. So the best advice is just, look, people might say, even your accountant, I've seen this before, oh, look, there's no depreciation deductions in that because it was built in the 1950s. Yeah, but what if it's just had a $200,000 new kitchen, bathroom and extension? Then you're going to be able to claim the deductions based on that. But the most kind of shocking statistic that I like to share when I'm asked this question is that we ran a bit of a research project where we looked at 1,000 residential property transactions. And what we were trying to figure out is what sort of missed deductions could be there. So what actually happens with a tax depreciation schedule is that it'll start from the date that you purchase, and you can back claim 2 financial years worth of deductions if you haven't done your tax return with the depreciation schedule in it. What we actually found is that 6.7% of those 1,000 people waited so long to get a depreciation schedule that they missed deductions. So the average amount of deductions that they missed was $20,537. And what we actually did is we extrapolated that across the investor population. So if you take 6.7% of all investors and you give them 20,537 worth of missed deductions, it actually came to $2.88 billion worth of unclaimed tax depreciation deductions for residential property investors. That's a huge sum, and I've taken that on as a bit of a personal mission to try and reduce that figure. And big shout out to the ATO, but I want to try and deny as much revenue as I can from you when it's legitimately unclaimed. I mean, this is not a tax loophole. This is written into the Income Tax Assessment Act of 1997. It's an entitlement, right? Because when you are a property investor, you are providing housing, you are providing a service. It's a much better deal for the government to use property investors to provide rental accommodation than own these assets themselves, right? So one thing that I think is worth teasing out in that is that 6.7% of property investors doesn't sound like a big number. But of course, once you apply everything and getting to 2.88 billion, it is. But that's 6.7% of people that eventually found us, because we're only studying our own data. We can only look at people that came to us. So the ones that never go to anybody, I kind of think that 6.7 number can only go up. There'll be people that have never heard about it. And I remember in that sample, we had a lady who bought an apartment off the plan and waited 16 years to get in touch with us. And she lost, it would have been, depending on what her marginal rate is, I think it would have been comfortably about $30,000 have gone from her pocket, not in terms of deductions, actually gone from her pocket. And that sort of stuff keeps me up nights.
Yeah, it's amazing statistics. And I mean, yeah, you hear that. I was about to say quite often we hear it through marketing as well. A lot of people who are selling off the plan house and land packages, that's one of the key selling terms is around depreciation and how you can get 30 grand back. And but I guess maybe once the deal's done, or if people buy directly from a builder, they don't know better. You don't know what you don't know, so they don't know to go through. And that's why from our side, yes, it's obviously as part of the client journey for us. Farah and her team will always send through that recommendation and the introduction to you guys to do that, or at least get a quote and see if it's worthwhile doing. Because there is if it's under 10 years, that's the only time it's valuable. No, that's not the truth. And so that's where these furphies sometimes exist, and people, like you said, don't do it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's hard too, because when we do a depreciation schedule, we send a copy to the accountant if we've got their details, because they may have some questions or there's things we can tweak to provide a better outcome. So we're always having that dialogue with them. But when we know that someone, it happens to me semi-regularly, people will say, oh, Mike, I've got this property and my accountant said it's not worth getting a depreciation schedule, but I was listening to you on Julian's podcast and I thought it's worth a call. And then we end up finding some deductions. We send a copy to the accountant, and gosh, I have to sort of hold it in to not sort of say to the accountant, please stop giving dodgy advice. You're costing your client money.
It's a very, very good point. And we will put some information in the show notes for those who want to reach out to Mike after the show. All those millions of people listening to us right now, Mike, they are reaching out to you tomorrow. So be by the phone. Well, no, thanks, Mike. That's a lot of wisdom for a self-proclaimed introvert. Thanks for switching on the personality and sharing your pearls of wisdom and insights, particularly into the market, in all seriousness, to get a different angle. Obviously, we use different forms of data. We've obviously got the big boys out there like the CoreLogics and the domains and, the H tags of the world. But it's interesting to hear your data because you're on the ground every day. That's your role. And you're getting a different subset of data as well. And yours is actually more, in my opinion, more up to date and real, because obviously we know CoreLogic, these other bigger platforms, it can be months out of sync in terms of what's happening on the ground. And that's one of the things we do say a lot about, what we can read or hear in the newspapers will generally be 3 months out of date because it hasn't, that clickbait's not going to kick in early. And we're still not seeing Melbourne on the radar yet for the big newspapers. So, once that tagline starts coming in, I think we're going to see a bigger rush into some of those markets in Melbourne or surrounds.
Well, like you were saying already, you were buying there a year or so ago with no competition. That was the time to be there. It's like Perth in 2021, right? Whereas the secret is out. It might not be national mainstream media, but you can just tell by the shoes at the front door of the open homes. People are looking at Melbourne.
Yeah, so it's a good time to get active. I guess one of our acronyms is turning on the tap, which is building your team of experts. And we always say a quantity surveyor is one of those experts having your team. And the A is for taking action. Really, it's time to take action. And then, like you said, can everyone pick the market by the date or by the year? No, we can't. But if you take action, you're going to be long-term setting up a property portfolio for success. And I guess Absolutely. The P to close that off is patience. Have patience because markets do go through different journeys. It's not always an upwardly growing market.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to be day trading property, and really you can't because of the cost of getting in and out is so prohibitive with stamp duty and selling costs and those sorts of things. So really the money is made, as you say, with patience over the long term. But yes, thank you very much for having me on the show, Julian. It's been a real pleasure.
Always great to chat to you, Mike. So thanks again for joining us on the Smart Investor Show. And of course, thanks to you for tuning in. I hope you got something valuable from this episode. If you enjoyed the show, it'd mean a lot if you could take a moment to rate and review it on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next time.